Thank you very much, conference organizers. I must say it's a very big pleasure for me to be here, to participate in this conference. Very big pleasure indeed, and I'm grateful to the organizers for inviting me. All protocol observed. Permit me therefore to begin by saluting the efforts of the organizers of this series of webs, the efforts of all the stakeholders. I sincerely believe, like the organizers, that this great awakening to the nefarious efforts of sexual violence and the need to put in place policies to prevent it, to restore the dignity of the victims, and to, make sure that this terrible phenomenon does not occur anymore, needs to be sustained. And I believe this is what is being done with the series of webinars that have been going on so far. Thank you once more for inviting me. It's really a pleasure. Sexual violence can be defined as physical or psychological violence out through sexual offense that targets sexual attempted molestation, sexual slavery, being forcing things through the genitalia or the anus, forced marriages, early marriages, mutilating people's genitals, sexual slavery or sexual servanthood to combatants. I totally appreciate the efforts that scholars and human and women rights activists have made to ensure that this issue is placed on the agenda of international organizations. Nonetheless, a closer reading shows that there are some aspects of this same issue, the issue of sexual violence and women's human rights, that needs to be looked into with some more detail. But before we get to that, perhaps I could just mention that violence against women inevitably makes them vulnerable and tend to feel victimized. This victimhood status has mental and psychological repercussions, not only on the women victims, but also and more especially on their immediate families, on their entourage, and on the society as a whole. It is therefore very important for African societies and nations to decipher and put in place mechanisms, laws, and policies which could guard against violence against women, minimize the effects and trauma of sexual violence, defend the victims, and protect the human rights of women. Violence against women and women's rights violations must therefore be given the attention that they deserve in discussions of human rights, and there must be a will to enforce, these policies. The theme of this third forum, the series of webinars entitled "Sexual Violence Issues and Women's Human Rights in Africa" is thus of a great allure, because it comes at a time when Africa is licking the wounds that have accrued from years of civil war in many countries, years of genocides in some and general political upheavals in others. As has been stated, women remain the real victims of turmoil in states and nations in which there is upheaval. The restoration of their human dignity after episodes of sexual violence generally becomes, therefore, a cause for concern involving not only concerted national action, but also the alliance of the international community. I therefore, once more, salute the organizers of these webinars, and because they have not only awakened to this great need, but have also sought to awaken the rest of the world. Like I said earlier, a lot has been done already to sensitize and to place this issue in the agendas of international organizations like the UNDP, the UN Security Council, UN Women, UNIFEM, and the World Bank, and many others. It is that needs some investigation. There is, for instance, or the net private, the secrecy about the issue of male rape continues to place women at a disadvantage. Finally, we will notice through this discussion that the recording and the remembering of rape against women has not quite been effected in African countries. And this hampers the enunciation and implementation of policies, to stop this phenomenon. Now, rape has always been regarded as a byproduct of war and conflicts. In some countries and some international organizations, it is considered as something which is inevitable, something which cannot be controlled, because it emanates from the uncontrolled sexual urges of soldiers who have been deprived of family warmth for a very long time, being at the war front. However, very recent thought about war and sexual violence seems to argue that sexual violence is not really an unavoidable phenomenon. It is rather considered as an aspect of a political strategy to weaken victims, to weaken opponents by destroying the valued aspect of women's, sexuality, which is their purity. We'll look at that later on. Whatever the matter, whatever the case, the underlying fact is that women are raped during war. Women are traumatized during war. They are made to be servants to the combatants. They are used as sexual slaves. And this trauma has an effect not only on the victims, but on the entire society. It is therefore incumbent on African societies to find ways of extirpating this phenomenon. It is incumbent on governments to put in place strategies and policies that can render women freer, render women capable to experience their own human rights, even in times of war. But the aspect that concerns us more in this paper is the aspects of rape that are made invisible. And one of these aspects is the rape of women in the private sphere. When rape is conducted in the public sphere of war and diplomacy, it is considered a crime, which is punishable by law. And this punishment arises from a UN resolution of 2008, because such a crime is considered as a crime against humanity and sometimes as genocide. But when rape is carried out in the private sphere of home and domesticity, it seems to be overlooked. It is this situation which is worrisome. It is this situation which has not been given the appropriate attention and which we wish to bring to the fore in this presentation. We contend that when rape is not well attended to, rape that happens in the private sphere, we contend that it is as a result of gender socialization, in which women's roles, in which a woman is not considered as something very important. Women matters concerning the women are considered a sphere, and therefore rape. We find this worrisome, and we intend to call the attention of policymakers even to this situation. We think that the breakdown of society into the private and the public spheres, and the restriction of women to the private sphere enhances and propagates atrocities like rape, and creates the social relations of power and control between men and women, and therefore continue to perpetuate the conditions necessary for rape. It is this privatization, I beg your pardon, it is this privatization that makes women silent, even when they suffer the trauma of rape, because it is considered a private affair. It is sometimes regarded with stigma and sometimes not quite punished in the law. Another form of sexual violence, which necessitates a deeper, more detailed attention, is a rape of men. It is becoming quite evident that not only women suffer rape, but that males also suffer rape. Boys and men suffer rapes, especially during wartime experiences. Examples abound among the refugees fleeing from the civil war in Congo, and it'd be possible to look at some of the pictures of this phenomenon. If you were to read my entire paper, I'm not sure it's possible right here, and the time scope is not good enough. It is a phenomenon. Permit me to just present a picture of a Cameroonian woman who was a wardress in charge of prisoners, but who was adopted from her duty post, swindled into the bushes, tortured, stripped naked, penetrated into her private parts with guns and shot right into her private parts with guns, and then assassinated, killed. This, was a typical case of the rape of women during wartime. The rape of men during wartime can be read, as I've said in my paper. It is a story of a young man who was a student in the University of Congo, but whose father was suspected of collaborating with the warriors and was killed. As he fled from the war, he was also abducted and was kept in a refugee camp, kept in the camp of the warriors, of the terrorists, where he was being raped continuously. These stories abound, and they need attention. They need our attention because when the rape of men is underlooked, this continues to falsify the narrative about sexual violence. It continues to make women feel as the ultimate victims. Meanwhile, there are male victims as well. And if male rape is highlighted, women's human rights are upheld. Women feel the equality that they need to feel with all of humanity. Women don't continue to feel as if they are the naturally gendered components of society, as if they are the natural victims, and as if they are the underside of society or the order of the man who is considered as the norm. So ignoring male rape actually does not only neglect the men, but it also harms women by enforcing a viewpoint that negates female, or that equates female with victimhood. In this way, women's human rights to honor, dignity, and reputation are dispensed with. I'd just like to show you a picture of a man who was raped. and how, because of the rape, he feels terribly disgusted with life, feels terribly traumatized. He can't have sex with his wife. He can't have sex because he had rape wounds, which he keeps trying to treat in hiding. But if male rape was, brought into the public sphere, brought into the limelight, men will take care of themselves. Organizations concerned with sexual violence will take care of the men as well. But when male rape is made a secret, men suffer unduly, and they are not taken care of. The third thing I'd like to talk about in this on this topic of some aspects of sexual violence which have not been considered quite well is the recording and the remembering of violence against women. We know very well that memory aids action. Recording and remembering violence against women is therefore a crucial strategic tool for ending the sexual violence that is perpetrated against women, a strategic tool for enhancing women's economic empowerment, for bringing about gender equality, and for increasing women's leadership and participation. When violence against women is recorded, remembered, and used in enacting policies, long-lasting peace and sustainable development can accrue. This then is followed by better health for women, better economic productivity, and the observance of their rights, which in the long run leads to social cohesion. Remembering is action, and forgetting is complacency. In Africa, it's easy to forget, not because women don't feel the pain of sexual violence, but because gender socialization is constructed within a complex matrix of the intersection between political, sociocultural, and economic factors, which inform norms and attitudes. Norms and attitudes concerning gender, therefore, are a result of a socialization that makes women feel like they must be subservient to men, makes men feel that they are the dominant type, they are the all-powerful, and they are in control. This state of affairs continues to undermine women's emancipation, and it continues to undermine the observance of women's human rights and even sustainable developments. It is possible to find data about sexual violence against women in international journals, in the international space. In 2016, for example, the UNDP report of human development in Africa noted that Africa has an alarmingly high rate of violence against women, and that this is based principally on societal norms which stereotype women's inferiority. We see that this is a sociocultural socialization which promotes violence against women. They are taught to be socially and economically inferior. Economically, a study was carried out in Tanzania, still in the 2016 UNDP report on Africa, and reveals that 43% of women in serious earn revenue than their peers. So when economic productivity for women goes down, they suffer violence. This lays more emphasis on economic factors at work, which cause violence on women. Statistics from the World Bank also show that the phenomenon of violence against women is still very much ingrained in the strategy of the World Bank on gender 2016 to 2033, about your pardon. We note that 46% of women in Africa have experienced one form of gender violence or another. In 2021, in 2016, the World Bank report entitled Women, Enterprise and the Law was a study carried out in 173 countries, that there are 943 differences in the treatment of men and women with regards to the law and access to economic opportunities. In some places, it even finds that there is a law which obstructs women's capacity to engage in economic enterprise. These cultural, political, and economic barriers against women's emancipation continue to put them in a disadvantaged position to men and help in fostering continuous gender discrimination. Discrimination means violation of women's human rights. But worse still, this goes simply unnoticed, unrecorded, and then not well disseminated for intervention. African countries continue to suffer the lack of a well-defined, significant, comprehensive, systematic, and nationally owned data collecting strategy. In Cameroon, for instance, women are still subordinated and subservient to men. They are considered weaker mentally and physically, and considered not appropriate for leadership or for business. The men operate in the public sphere and engage with politics, business, and high professionalism, while the women are relegated to the private sphere of domesticity, reproduction, family nurturance, and even though the situation has changed a bit, a lot still needs to be done. This research carried out in Cameroon, the research for this paper was carried out at the Cameroon's Ministry for the Promotion of Women and the Family. And it shows that violence against women exists. In the yearly statistical yearbook of the ministry, many cases of violence are recorded, but these cases show a marked underestimation of the situation because they haven't been carried out through a logical survey. Rather, the said data was collected very haphazardly through police reports or reports of victims to the police, reports of victims in the hospitals, and reports of victims to the women promotion centers. When we realize that in a society where women are not supposed to be heard, where they are not supposed to carry out matters of their home into the public sphere, very little is being reported. Therefore, the data is haphazard and non-randomized. Countries in the African region have not conducted surveys specifically designed to collect data on violence on women in all its dimensions. Instead, the data has traditionally been collected using reproductive health surveys, crime and victimization surveys, and a multiple indicator cluster survey and policy statistics. The interplay of violence against reporting in cases of violence results in the marginality of the data collected. Hence, to get more precise data on prevalence rates, causes, women's experiences of violence, and the consequences for them and their families, it is more important to implement surveys that specifically focus on violence on women and young girls, because the data on these surveys provide critical information for the design of intervention. Such data will help to challenge entrenched views of women's silence and acceptance of violence. It will highlight the intergenerational nature of abuse and intergenerational transfer of abuse, and it will also shape the understanding of the consequences of violence and how women cope with them. Without this data, therefore, it will be very difficult to target intervention that will effectively respond to the actual reality of women's experience of violence. Perhaps it would be good at this point to make some recommendations for a better fight against violence against women and a better enhancement of women's human rights in cases where sexual violence prevails against them. It would be also better to state that continental response to putting in place policies will do far much better than national response. And continental response could be helped by two factors. The first is that there's only one variable in violence against women in Africa, and that variable is that the degree of violence varies from one country to another, but violence against women, sexual violence, is a reality, is a truth, is a fact of women's everyday lives in Africa. Secondly, we can look at the commonalities that can help continental response to putting in place policies to extirpate violence against sexual violence against women. In common, African countries or African women are never more disadvantaged than men. In common, it will be rare to find an African country in which African women are more advantaged than men. It will be very rare. Also, African societies are gender sensitive, yet their laws are gender neutral. Continental response will take this into consideration for putting in place better policies and laws. Finally, economic and social stress, especially with COVID and the pandemic of COVID, exponentially increased gender violence. And this will be important in putting in place a continental plan of action and strategy to fight sexual violence against women. But countries could also individually enforce laws by considering the following recommendations. One, that they could use pre-existing national child protection programs and adapt targeting methodologies to ensure that women who have been sexually violated are taken care of. They could put cash in women's hands through stimulus or insurance schemes. Also, they could extend social protection to informal workers, workers in houses who work as house helps and baby nurses, office cleaners, restaurant owners and bar owners, and those who work in the informal sector have the propensity to experience more sexual-oriented violence. Financial support needs to target hard-hit women-led enterprises and businesses in feminized sectors with subsidized and state-backed loans. State-backed loans help women to take loans without having to pay heavy interest. We can also design domestic violence shelters or hotlines and make them essential services by increasing resources to them, groups to be at the front line of response. Nations could also expand the capacity of shelters for victims of violence by repurposing other spaces, such as empty hotels and educational institutions in this time of the COVID pandemic. Crisis task forces, emergency responses and teams, interagency committees could also work, and in their work, they could have equal representation of women and men as a measure to increase gender responsive decision-making. Nations could also implement a proper population-based survey, which is systematic and comprehensive, to assess the prevalence and insistence of sexual violence, and this will allow a better policy formation. Finally, it will be important to include women in policy making because it is they who know how the shoe fits and where it pinches. It will be difficult for nations to work single-handedly, but they could work with non-governmental organizations and international organizations. And for that, they could consider recommendations as follows. They could improve sensitization and information mechanisms. They could improve the physical and mental health of the population. They could do action-oriented research by scholars and other researchers. They could recommend actions to protect women's rights. And they could plan to draw national action plans and commitments related to women, peace and security, and include women's civil society organizations in the planning processes. In conclusion, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, government's inability to keep viable records and statistics on violence against women in Africa results in their inability to vigorously persecute perpetrators of the phenomenon. A more comprehensive, regular, and systematic data collection and recording will have to give a clear picture of the incidence and the prevalence of this phenomenon through either a population-based survey showing, on the one hand, the type, nature, and scope of the most common form of violence, and on the other hand, an administrative service-based data collected report or the sectorial resources stating whether or not the responses produced are meeting the needs of those who have experienced violence. In order for peace and security to return, sexual violence against men cannot continue to be kept a secret. It should be brought into the limelight so that men and women can feel that they are each other's keeper and that they are equal. Similarly, violence should be prosecuted, whether it occurs in the private or in the public sectors. Gender mainstreaming should be an essential process when enacting policy to combat sexual violence. In addition, rapid gender assessments, the focus on women in situations of vulnerability, should be conducted as soon as possible. These domestic violence shelters, our hotlines, should be identified as essential services, not optional services, and not incidental in the fight against violence against women. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I know there'll be lots of questions and I'm ready for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mutia. You are very, very comprehensive and great overview of sexual violence against women in Africa, and also the inclusion of violence, especially rape of men also during conflicts and wars, which has been overlooked as well. I know there are many, many questions to be asked, and you provided some good information for us to be thinking about, and especially the recommendations to governments and to individual NGOs are very useful. And we will talk more about that during the question and answer period. I would now like to invite our speaker, Mr. Joseph Bitamba, to join us and to present his views through his experiences. But there's one thing I want to add about Mr. Bitamba that I found in the New Times of Rwanda, just to show how passionate he is in his work on sexual violence and war crime, rape, and in that area. And I quote, this is from an interview he had with the Rwanda newspaper, and I quote, "I have been socially supported by women. I was raised by a woman since I lost my father as a little boy. I grew in the company of two sisters. And in my career, it has always been women helping me. I don't know why, but even when I joined TV, it was with the help of a foreign lady. So we can see his passion is leading him into doing the great things that he does to highlight and to spread the evils of rape and sexual violence during conflicts and wars. His work comes from the heart, and we invite Mr. Bitamba to share his experiences. And please, you have about, just a reminder, 10 to 15 minutes, and we'll have plenty of time for question and answers and for more discussions. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you all for inviting me. I always start the discussion like about this subject by quoting Nelson Mandela, who said, I quote, "Freedom cannot be achieved unless women have been emancipated from all forms of oppression." And I believe in this phrase of Nelson Mandela. I'm going to speak about my experience doing this film, where I met in 3 countries women who have been raped. During my shooting, I focused my work on the Great Lakes region, and especially on 3 countries, Burundi, Congo, and Rwanda. I started with Rwanda, theater of the worst genocide of the end of the 20th century, the genocide that occurred in 1994. I continue with Congo and ended with Burundi, where a violent conflict broke out in 2015. The Great Lakes region has been the scene of cyclical violent conflicts since the period of independence. Barbaric acts have increased dramatically since the 90s. Rape as weapon for defeat enemy has been used widely. This is especially true in those 3 countries, namely Burundi, Rwanda, and Congo. In this presentation, I quote the participants, psychologists, survivors, members of associations who work tirelessly to make the lives of those survivors better. My first part is about Rwanda. During the 1994 genocide, rape was used as a weapon of war in Rwanda. Over 250,000 women have been raped according to official data. I have to say that Association of Women say that there is over than 500,000 women who has been raped. Patrick, I met in Huye a special man who helped those women. This is Patrick Wagatarian. He's a psychologist. He's a director of the Huye Isange Rehabilitation Center. I quote Patrick, "I have worked at the International Criminal Tribunal for the Rwanda and encountered this issue because the issue is the violence, the rape. I was responsible of supporting the victims who had to testify in Arusha. Arusha is where the tribunal was. This is when I met a group of women and they were getting ready to testify in Arusha later. When they returned, we noticed that their pain was expressed physically, and this completely discussed the doctor we worked with. During the process of supporting them individually, with my colleague who was a nurse trained as a counselor, we eventually realized that all those women had one thing in common. They were all raped during the genocide. We then set up support group which allowed them to come together and talk. Talking is that setup allowed them to regain their psychological strength and go back to the beginning in order to try and start to rebuild a life that was torn apart during the genocide. Rape in Rwanda was systematically used as a powerful weapon during the genocide. Rape was not something that was just there, disorganized or haphazard. Instead, it was organized hierarchically. I think I talk about in the article. He wrote an article, a famous article in a Belgium magazine. I mentioned the case of a former burgomaster of Taba commune. Burgomaster is like a mayor, who was tried at the criminal court. I think he was condemned to life in prison, if I'm not mistaken. It is him who told the militian men that it was not only the militian men who raped women, anyone could help himself. He told them, listen, do not ask me what a Tutsi woman tastes like. They mutilated women. They cut their genital organs. They shoved sharp objects into the vagina with an unfathomable cruelty. By doing so, in addition to the visible destruction of human life, they targeted this invisible destruction of the source of life and thought. I choose to talk about the case of a young lady today who has overcome this situation. This is Marguerite. She was raped during the genocide when she was still a child. I think she was 7. This rapist transmitted HIV AIDS to her. Marguerite was young. I caught her. I lived with my parents. They loved me the way any parent loves their child. When the genocide broke out, I did not understand what was going on. I slowly understood what was going on once I saw a certain category of people either being killed or chased away from their homes and their cattle eaten. I was quite young. I was only 7 years old. My father sought refuge at the Adeper, a parish in Abyssinia. My mother took me in hiding at her relatives. There was no peace either when we got there. My grandma has received death threats, and so did my mother and I via mail. They knew we were there. A man called Rustinde was tracking them. My mother and I left after that, but there were roadblocks everywhere. They would made us sit there and say to my mother, leave the child, referring to me. We slept in the woods. A man holding a rod came by, a man holding a rod came by and asked what we were up. My mother explained that we were of the run, and he asked me why. Once she explained we were fleeing the killings, he offered us a place to hide. We thought he was a good guy, but he was an Interahamwe who was a militian man. He took us to a home where he locked us in a room and left. There was no one else in there. He used to come and ask my mother to follow him outside for a sunbath. I sometimes heard her howling, but she wouldn't say anything upon return. One day, he took me to sunbath too. My mother, who knew the meaning of the sunbathing, started crying. He raped me and threatened me to kill me if I recounted to my mother. Then came manipulation. I'm going to go through this one and took the last part. I took, it was, the militia liberated them. It was much later that my mom became sick. For a year, I was her care attendant in hospital. We knew she suffered from AIDS, but there was no treatment at the time. She died in the end, and my young brother and I remained on our own. I took on a modest job, and there doing the laundry, helping crops fields, just to support us. I fell sick from all the heavy work I was doing. That's when I found out that I had been contaminated with AIDS when I was raped. The news was hard to swallow. My life and my dreams to one day marry and have children were shattered. All the distress and pain left me feeling as though my heart were torn apart with pain. Life suddenly felt meaningless. I attempted to commit suicide, but by taking rat poison, I kept wishing he had killed me after raping me. Worse still, I couldn't remember his face. I couldn't testify once the Gacaca tribunal were set up, and my mother was no longer there to help me identify him. What I didn't write is that Marguerite found a husband. Now she's a mother of 2 young boys. I go back to Patrick, who is psychologic, telling us how the Rwanda society was before the genocide. To have endured such atrocious acts and on top of being victim, to carry a sense of guilt as if somehow one is responsible, I think that is where things become somewhat complicated for those who feel ashamed. We should recall the rape was done in the open, in front of everyone. Genocide happened during the day. They killed in broad daylight and rested at night. And when they killed, they could rape too. There was collective rape done in front of everyone. Even children saw things they should have never seen. So think about a woman who was raped in front of children who were called to come and watch. The particularity of our genocide is that even after the genocide, people were forced to try and live together again. Think about those women who were raped in front of everyone. It is a very painful situation. One wonders how you go on living after having endured the unspeakable. I think that is what we were trying to do. We provided this platform so those women can verbalize what they went through, that pain, and that is why they even talk of the concept of origination, where one digs in their deepest being to find the strength to overcome or unpack that trauma. There are countries that traditionally practice genital mutilation, like in West African countries, where excision is practiced. On the contrary, in Rwanda, there are cultural practices that seek to enhance the shared sexual pleasure. And beyond this, women were very respected in Rwanda society. The king governed with his mother. The queen had a voice and advised discreetly her husband. In addition, during war or violent time, women were never attacked. And we heard that if by misfortune a woman was killed, there were purification rituals that were done. So one wonders how we went from highly regarding women to the other extreme, to attacking them with such cruel violence. That is a question we ask ourselves, and I must say that we found difficult to answer. Emilienne is also a psychologist. She worked with Patrick, and she created this psychologist and group. I met those women. They are like 20 women. They had never spoke about it before, and they accepted to be in my film. Emilienne, I quote Emilienne, the majority are married and have children. It is difficult as this is a taboo in our society. Here, it is assumed that a woman who gets raped is responsible for it. At the very least, that she did something that led to it. That is how our society judges them. I met many of them in 2007 when they filed a suit against the rapist. Some of them testified in public while others could not gather the strength to do so. Proceedings were not public, but they felt shame in front of the judge, the prosecutor, the lawyer. My work consisted in accompanying them, those women, during the trials, and I came to really understand their suffering. I thought they need a meeting place where they could freely talk about what happened to them and tell their stories at Cachacha. They were raped all during the genocide.
Oh, excuse me, Mr.
Yes.
Could you round it up in about a minute or two so we have a lot of time for discussions, please? Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to Burundi case. Congo is well known. Congo is well known, I think. And
Burundi, yeah.
Okay. Burundi was the last one. Yeah. I finished with the Burundi. I will not quote the women who were raped. In 2015, President Nkurunziza announced that he would run to third term in office, and that triggered peaceful protest by citizens. So I quote only Katie and the leaders of women. What happened? We were in the street on the 30th May 2015. Some started receiving messages on the phone, and we realized that and so what happened? A terrible repression was launched using the fake coup as a motive to track down the people individually who demonstrated or opposed the third term. In women who was seen identify the picture who was seen or identified on the pictures. She said something important. I'm looking for that, and I will finish with that. The aim of rape is to erase the woman. What rape seeks to achieve is truly to annihilate women. And that is precisely what we reject. We refuse to be annihilated, silenced, reduced to oblivion. No, this is a powerful way to resist. That's it. I finished there because unless it will be long. Yeah.
where there'll be enough time for questions and answers, and during that time you can elaborate more with some
Okay.
examples of the interviews you had with those women. Thank you very much again. At this time, I would like to invite our third speaker, Dr. Yoon Myung-suk, to share with us her thoughts and her research findings on the issue of comfort women and the comfort stations systems by the Japanese Imperial Army. And just a reminder again about the time. If you can keep it within 10 to 15 minutes, that will be appreciated. And the goal here, the aim is for us to have enough time for everyone to ask questions and for you, the speakers, to elaborate on issues that you couldn't due to the time constraint. Thank you. Miss Dr. Yoon, on mute, please.
Thank you for your presentation and discussion. As a woman living in South Korea, I don't have a lot of information about what's going on in Africa. I don't know a lot about Africa situations. Maybe those who have a special interest in African situations, they would know more. But for me, I even don't understand like how many countries are in Africa. Like for me, Africa comes as one continent. So even though I am a historian, I have to admit that I didn't have a lot of knowledge of the history in Africa. So I learned a lot from your presentation and discussion. So even though I am not aware of the current situations of women in Africa, but as a historian who has a special interest in women's human rights issue, I would like to discuss how we can make connections between the suffering and experience of women during during conflicts to the modern history of the country, the current situations. So if I make any mistakes in analyzing or understanding the African specific situations, please correct me later. Because I am not good at English, I received a summary of your presentation translated into Korean. And I also used the Google translation function to understand your presentation. Your presentations were very full, comprehensive, length, and I learned a lot simply by reading your presentations. And there are a few points that I would like to share after reading your presentations. First of all, the most outstanding point of view from the presentations by Dr. Mutia was that you showed special interest in sexual violence against male. In the specific context of South Korea and Japan, As you know, we have been discussing creating a fund for the victims by sexual violence committed by the Japanese military. And there is one case that one male victim from Netherlands received funding for as a part of this sexual violence victims redress funding. So there is not enough information about the victims, his identity, but we only guess that because he was a soldier, maybe he was captured as a prisoner of war, and he was sexually abused during his prison camp. But anyway, when we speak about victims of sexual violence, we understand that more than 80% of the victims are women. And almost more than 90%, and actually almost 100% the perpetrators are male. So in general, victims are women and perpetrators are men, but it's not the case always. So it's possible that there is the same gender becomes a victim and a perpetrator. But in other crimes, it's possible that the victim and the perpetrator are in the same gender, but sexual violence has a different characteristics because there is a difference between the identity of victims and the gender of the perpetrators, and that makes this problem even more difficult to address. And so here comes the question. I want to know why Dr. Mutia raised the issue of sexual violence against male when we discuss sexual violence against women. So what's the connection? Like, what do you want to point out by raising the issue, especially about sexual violence against male? Is it because you think we have to respect male victims in sexual violence? In South Korea, we have only short history, maybe since the late 1990s, 1980s. Since the late 1980s, we have been only able to speak out about sexual violence against women publicly in Korean society. There was a very famous case of a political prisoner who was tortured sexually, and she spoke out about her experience. Only since then, it became important for victims to speak out their experiences, and it has been converged with the civil society movement to raise the issue of sexual slavery by Japanese military. So I don't think we have a long history of
그리고 그것을 해야 하기에는 한국의 여성, 그러니까 한국뿐만이 아니라
addressing sexual violence.
여성에 대한 차별, 가부장적인
And I think
생각,
there is
여성 성차별, 뭐 이런 뿌리 깊은
underlining
여전히 남아 있고 그것과 함께 이 문제를 고려를
like
생각하고 고민해가지고
traditional societal concept of gender gender difference or like a patriarchal concept that women are inferior than men.
여성의 성폭력 중에서도 강간이라고 하는
And
부분이
especially rape
요인화되어져서
amongst all different forms of sexual violence against women
얼마만큼 우리가 지금 공유하고 있는지는 잘 모르겠으나
has been
그 위안부 문제가 군에 의한 성폭력 피해라고 하는
a big agenda.
다들
But
공유하고 있다라고 생각을
so I wonder,
그런데 이제 일본군 위안부 문제가
sexual slavery issues,
90년대 초에 국제적인
like how much international attention sexual slavery issues such as comfort to women by the Japanese military have been noticed. In the level of international community, such as the United Nations,
전시하 성폭력이라고 하는 그 부분에서 굉장히
Japanese comfort to women issue have been recognized as a part of sexual violence during the war and conflicts. But I think Japanese comfort to women or sexual slavery issues are much more complicated than simply identifying that as a form of sexual violence during war. I'm trying to share my screen where I can show you my screen from my iPad. Can you see this? This is the diagrams. So I will just describe. So Japanese comfort to women issue. So when we speak of sexual violence, rape is one of those categories. For example, rape victims or mass rape issues during the Mangyang massacre, that was the Japanese killing civilians in China during the Sino-Japan War. But comfort women or sexual slavery is different from those mass rape during the war, because in order to operate sexual slavery or comfort to women system, you need a system, you need facilities to institutionalize the slavery system. You need comfort to women facilities, and you have to recruit those sexual slaves. And so it's more complicated than addressing that issue as a rape category. So comfort women was to borrow prostitutes and commit prostitutes in a forceful form of rape. So like when it comes to prostitute, people say that if you receive the money by selling your sex, then it is not slavery because you receive the money. It gives you wrong impression, that wrong perception that those people who have been victimized as a prostitute, you don't recognize them as victims. So maybe the problem is that we don't feel guilty for our prostitution system. And that is the issue that we have to address. And these issues actually exacerbates our conflicts about sexual slavery by Japanese military, because many people try to identify Japanese comfort to women issue as voluntary prostitution. In that aspect, I think Japanese comfort to women issue could be categorized as rape or sexual violence during the war, but it is not limited to the specific time period of war. It could date back to far before the war broke out. And it is rooted deeply in our society as stereotype against women. And we have to recognize this context and background of Japanese comfort to women issue. And Joseph presented different experiences from Rwanda genocide. It was so painful to hear those stories. And from the presentation, I learned that there was International Criminal Court of Rwanda, and their rape was recognized as a genocide. So I wonder, or I would like to ask whether the international community or the International Criminal Court officially recognized the rape as a war crime and punished the perpetrator, the rapist, as a war criminal. That's my question to Joseph.